They came at dusk. 4 dark shapes rode the ridge, like punctuation against the sun. A small valley lay below. Tile roofs, a ribbon of road, thin smoke from a single chimney. Fields held bodies bent to harvest. Footfalls slowing as the villagers looked up. The light was low and flat. Shadows stretched long from the ridge toward the town, drawing the eye. The riders did not hurry. Their horses moved with a quiet surety. No trumpet sounded. No banners snapped. When they reached the highest crest, they stopped. For a long moment, there was only the slow dip of the sun and the breath of the animals. The air itself seemed to change. The birds slowed their calls. The wind held its hand. People felt it in the joints and the throat, as if weather and thought had shifted together. The riders were indistinct. Silhouettes yielded no detail. One figure sat with a hand loose at his side. Another leaned forward, looking where the valley spread open. The third sat straight as a post. The fourth's cloak caught the light and dark like a blade. Their presence filled the space without noise. It was the kind of presence that makes a place honest and small things rearrange themselves. Tools were set down. Conversations fell to single words. A child in a field stopped mid-swing. Below, smoke thinned along the horizon, and the village seemed to inhale. Someone prayed without meaning to, and someone simply set the basket down. The ridge was far, the riders remote, but their shape read like a sentence. The valley answered with stillness. Dusk folded over the land. The 4 men watched. Night leaned in. What came next had not yet formed, but the world had already noted them. Silence. Quiet.
People noticed small shifts before they could name them. In the market lane, coughs began to thread between stalls like a thin, persistent wind. A child leaned against an empty stall and coughed. A woman folded her shawl tighter and watched a basket lie askew where it had always sat. A vendor lifted a coin and it vanished at his fingertips, as if a breath had taken it. A cart stalled at the square. Its wheels sank a half-inch, and the mule would not move. The driver muttered and pushed, and finally walked home barefoot. Numbers shifted in ledgers. A clerk would write a sum, rub his sleeve, and the ink would thin until a total simply was not there. At first, men said it was mischance, spoiled bread, a missed delivery, a cold snap. Then the pattern became clear in its small cruelty. They noticed the shadow moving across roofs, the hush that fell when a door opened, the way a sorrow gathered around a single hearth and would not be shaken free. At the center of town, a boy coughed until his face went white and then pink again. His mother soothed him and named every herb and boiled every broth, but the sound did not stop. In a dim room, a ledger sat open beneath a candle. An account disappeared between 2 nights, and the family argued until their voices were small and raw. No herald announced the change. The riders did not touch a hand, and yet their presence rearranged the small machinery of days. Coughs spread, wheels stuck, sums fell away. People began to speak the riders' names, as if that might explain it. Half in fear, half like a map to avoid. Mothers crossed thresholds with new care. Shopkeepers counted twice and then 3 times. A man who had planned a voyage found his charts smeared and stayed home. A woman with a sick child found neighbors kinder or simply wearier. Outside the ridge, the riders moved without hurry, watching small economies unspool as lives rerouted around very tiny failures. They said nothing, but their passage left a trail of rearranged days and narrower breaths. Markets emptied before anyone spoke of hunger. Stall keepers closed the shutters, folded cloth, and set down the scales that no hand could fill. Fields looked the same at a distance, but closer the soil cracked and the green curled inward. A cartwheel sank in dust where mud once clung after spring rains. Households counted jars, then jars counted them. Bread shops shuttered their ovens and left loaves to grow hard in the heat. People learned to measure smaller, to stretch one stew between more mouths. Silence pressed in shops where chatter had been. A pale rider watched from a doorway and did not need to move to make shelves thin. His horse stood like a shadow, patient. Children opened cupboards and found air where maize once sat. Dogs nosed the empty corners of barns and trotted away as if embarrassed. Fingers traced jars that gave only grit. Traders who had once argued over coin now argued over a single bag split 3 ways. A woman traded a braid of hair for a handful of barley. Men nervously watched doorways. The hollow grew without voice. A rot that asked only for time spread through root and granary. It did not thunder. It seeped, patient and indifferent, a removal of something once taken for granted. At night, people walked with shadows elongated by lamplight, learning to count mouths by movement rather than sound. Older folk remembered years when barns bruised with grain and children rose heavy with meal. A pale rider did not hand out relief. He passed a town, and the town learned the slow arithmetic of absence. Gardens shrank to potted herbs. Courtyards kept their echoes. People still shared the little they had. A boy gave a dried pear to his sister and smiled without boasting. It was a small thing, and yet it bridged the thinness for a moment. The hollow kept growing, slow as breath. Farmers watched seed fail in rows. Some left at dawn with a sack and a question. Others stayed, tending miracle potted greens, and kept making table room for the hungry who remained. Smoke curls on the ridge, flags tremble. On the ridge the rider makes slow turn. Soldiers line paths and hold breath now. Hands clench on banners and on old debt. A woman counts doors and pins shawl now. Smoke curls on the ridge, flags tremble. On the ridge the rider makes slow turn. Soldiers line paths and hold breath now. Hands clench on banners and on old debt. A woman counts doors and pins shawl now. Smoke curls on the ridge, flags tremble. On the ridge the rider makes slow turn. Soldiers line paths and hold breath now. Hands clench on banners and on old debt. A woman counts doors and pins shawl now. Smoke curls on the ridge, flags tremble. On the ridge the rider makes slow turn. Soldiers line paths and hold breath now. Hands clench on banners and on old debt. A woman counts doors and pins shawl now. Smoke curls on the ridge, flags tremble. On the ridge the rider makes slow turn. Soldiers line paths and hold breath now. Hands clench on banners and on old debt. A woman counts doors and pins shawl now. Smoke curls on the ridge, flags tremble. On the ridge the rider makes slow turn. Soldiers line paths and hold breath now. Hands clench on banners and on old debt. A woman counts doors and pins shawl now. Smoke curls on the ridge, flags tremble. On the ridge the rider makes slow turn. Soldiers line paths and hold breath now. Hands clench on banners and on old debt. A woman counts doors and pins shawl now. Smoke curls on the ridge, flags tremble. On the ridge the rider makes slow turn. Soldiers line paths and hold breath now. Hands clench on banners and on old debt. A woman counts doors and pins shawl now. Smoke curls on the ridge, flags tremble. On the ridge the rider makes slow turn. Soldiers line paths and hold breath now. Hands clench on banners and on old debt. A woman counts doors and pins shawl now. Smoke curls on the ridge, flags tremble. On the ridge the rider makes slow turn. Soldiers line paths and hold breath now. Hands clench on banners and on old debt. A woman counts doors and pins shawl now. Smoke curls on the ridge, flags tremble. On the ridge the rider makes slow turn. Soldiers line paths and hold breath now. Hands clench on banners and on old debt. A woman counts doors and pins shawl now. Night had turned the infirmary into a low, steady ache. Lanterns hung along the rafters and threw oval pools of light over rows of cots. The air tasted of boiled broth and salt, of old cloth and the copper tang of blood.
Nurses moved between beds with practiced economy. Hands that had learned to be gentle and quick did both, tying splints, washing fevered skin, pressing cool cloths to foreheads. They spoke little, a name, a number, a time to come back. When noise rose, it was always small. The rustle of cloth, the hiss of a lamp, the thin wail of someone who could not sleep. Outside, horse hooves had left dark prints in the lane. Through a cracked window of the infirmary, a shape stood against the moon. A dark flank, the slack breath of a great head. The rider a silhouette too still to be real. The presence pressed at the walls like a cold hand. Sickness sharpened in the rooms nearest the window, as if the air itself carried orders. By the cot near the door, a woman coughed and counted her breaths. A child collapsed between blankets and did not know the time. The caregivers wrapped them in linen soaked with vinegar, fed thin gruel, whispered prayers that did not expect answer. They kept the weak upright, coaxed water into clenched hands, wiped away spittle and sleep from jagged mouths. They worked through the night because there was no choice. When a rider passed, fever ran faster. Pustules broke with cruel speed. Wounds that had burned slowly flared in a rash. The village that had been steady with chores and barter unraveled into a ledger of needs. Each caregiver's small triumph, an eased breath, a softening eyelid, felt like theft from the tide. A boy who had been a cooper an hour before sat so still a nurse thought he had died. She changed his bandages and found him breathing, tiny and stubborn. Hands on a child's shoulder steadied a frightened body until sleep took it. Outside, the horse shifted. The rider's cloak fell back in a way that showed nothing and everything.
They gathered at the river as twilight folded the hills. Simple coffins lay in a short row on damp earth. Lids closed, hands left on top, as if to remember a weight. Mourners stood apart in low groups, shawls and rough coats forming islands along the bank. Children kept to doorways. An old man leaned on a spade and did not dig. A pale rider watched at the water's edge. The horse's breath made a thin film of mist that the river took. When someone spoke of a name, it seemed to sink like a stone and be heard only underwater. Families moved with a private speed. A woman folding a child's shirt at the door. A man setting a cup aside as if it might clink in another house. Strangers made graves like a mechanical sorrow. They worked with the efficiency of those who have been told what must be done. A bell from the chapel rang twice, and then not at all. Time contracted to the small rituals that remain. No one tried to chase the rider. The air folded around him like the end of a story. He did not hurry, and that slowed everything. Footsteps paused. Conversations thinned. Breath became visible and then dissolved. Grief here was not loud. It was hands that would not let go, eyes that would not look away. A tobacco packet opened and left on the ground. A woman touched the coffin, as if to check that nothing of the body remained. A small sound like paper on paper. A rider untied a candle from his saddle and set it among the others. The flame wavered and joined the line. Someone began to sing a hymn in a voice that had not expected to hold itself steady. The notes kept slipping into silence. At the center of the bank, a grave waited, its mouth dug like a secret. It was not for strangers, but for the town itself. When the first coffin slid down the slope, the water caught its edge and carried with it a small sound, like a lock closing. People leaned forward as if to watch that noise pass. Their faces were not only sorrowful, but weary with the business of being alive any longer. Quiet. They stood in a line on the ridge, 4 silhouettes watching the land below shift and answer to them. Each turned to his own compass, silent and absolute. They did not move. Each gaze stretched, quiet. One looked over fields. At first the wheat leaned, then the stems went pale and thin.
The wells pulled back a little. Crows kept time on bare fence posts, patient and cleanly. They bent toward dust. Another turned toward the city, where roofs lay tight and streets ran like a lattice. Windows went dark in slow measure. Lamps guttered, but no hand came. Bread stacked under shutters cooled and hushed. A third faced the infirmary. Lanterns made islands in the rafters. Voices fell like cloth. Hands moved in a steady, blind rhythm. Trays of bottles cooled on benches. No one called out anymore. Quiet. The last rider watched the road where men had made lines in the dust. Flags hung limp. The din outside had collapsed into small, sharp echoes. Weapons were left where they fell. Boots lay in the mud. They did not mark time together. One face angled toward grain, another toward roof lines, a third toward lamps and cots, the fourth toward the lines of men. The ridge held them. Silence held. None spoke. Wind moved under their cloaks, but their faces held a calm like stone. From the ridge, the valley looked made of cards, fragile and precise. Little lights winked and went out in patterns. No answer came. They made no gesture. Each existence bent the world in a small way. Rot crept into grain, hunger hollowed pantries, fever threaded breaths, and battle broke the sleep of roads. Their presence was law. No words passed between them. Leather creaked, reins shifted. Once, one rider lifted his chin toward a thin wisp of smoke, and then lowered it. The others matched a breath, a tilt. Their silence held. They did not boast. Their work was not loud. The valley changed in small, ordered ways. Farms thinned. Shops darkened. Wards folded like paper. And soldiers lay quiet. From the ridge, they were a line. They woke to new rules. At dawn, doors were latched. Families balanced oil lamps in narrow halls and threaded keys through rough locks. A notice, stamped by a hand no one could trace, appeared on the square. Curfew at dusk, market at the river, no gatherings over 6. People read it like a weather report and folded their plans around it. Shadows sat by stalls, watching the river markets form in small circles beneath bridges. Lanterns bobbing like pools on black water. Messengers still ran, but slower, breath measured for curfew. Traders learned stack wares into small crates and teach their children where to hide. Houses that sat open for years, doors barred with iron and prayer. Lamps hung low and windows shuttered to shapes of sky. Notices posted on doors, on tavern posts, on bread carts. Small groups learned to trade by the hush of lamps. They left coins and cloth, or traded bread for thread. Nights shortened, and people learned routes by memory and the maps in their heads redrawn. A quiet order settled like a hand across the city. Noted to poles, a single rider's shadow crossed the square and stretched as if to measure every footstep. At dusk the bells tolled and shutters closed in a slow roll. Lanterns flared like careful promises, and the streets learned where they were permitted to gather. Even the thieves adapted. Silent deals done quickly at corners where a horseman might pass. Children learned to cross at known gates and keep to ledges. Balconies served as lookouts. Not all windows used now. A silence fell that was not anger, but a thin attention, as if the city listened. On the ridge, the riders watched. One shadow moved slow across the square, and the city rearranged itself. People moved within new lanes, and bedrock memory kept the names of safe doorways. The horsemen did not ride through lanes, but their presence felt in the tightening of shutters, in faster knots of rope, and in the quiet barter of secrets and water. The city recast itself slowly, and the ridge. People moved like cautious tides. Some gathered their things at dawn and walked toward the far hills. Faces turned away from the ridge. Others stayed. The woman at the corner stall tore her small loaf in pieces and handed them to 3 children whose bellies had been quiet for days. Her hands were work rough and steady. She did not ask who their parents were. They ate with a hush, stealing warmth from the bread, and she watched them as if each bite kept the town from falling into a larger dark. A soldier, helmet in hand, stood along the main road. He had patrolled until his shoulders ached and his orders tasted like ash. He looked at his spear, then at the line of houses, at the faces that had once been customers and neighbors. Without ceremony, he set the spear into the earth and leaned his forehead against the shaft for a long moment. The gesture was small. It altered the mood like a slow unhooking of a bell. Others saw and lowered bars, loosening the coiled readiness that had kept them rigid. Caregivers moved in pairs with pails and blankets. They passed a bucket of water from hands to hands between houses, splashing and laughing softly when a child shrieked and ducked the spray. Their steps stitched the streets together, lightening the weight of empty cupboards and tired backs. They did not wait for orders. They followed what needed doing. A few knelt outside the chapel, voices low and unshowy. They did not command miracles. They made room for grief and for gratitude. Some swore oaths to leave. Some promised to return. Some admitted fear and stayed to tend the dying. Each small choice accumulated, like beads on a string, until the town had a new shape. The riders watched. The earth answered their presence in quiet ways. But it was these human decisions that remade what would remain. Where hands reached, bread was eaten. Where spears were laid down, children played. Where water was carried, life lingered. The living decided, and the valley answered. It would change. At dawn, the ridge was empty. Saddles leaned against a low stone wall, straps loosed, stirrups still. Far chimneys sent up thin threads of smoke, and a few fields showed the first stubborn green where nothing had been. Windows were boarded on some streets. On others, shutters opened, as if a single decision had passed, like a warm hand along the houses. People came down from the hills with slow, uncertain steps. They met one another with quiet nods and spoke in small, practical phrases. Who had water? Who could mend a roof? Which lane to avoid? A woman knelt in a furrow and let soil run between her fingers. It smelled of ash, of broth, and of something like new growth. Children chased one another in the square until they tired and sat to look at empty saddles, tracing a strap with a small finger, as if learning the name of a thing that had been a story. Not every place healed at the same pace. A house at the river kept its shutters nailed, and the smell of candle wax and sickness lingered like a warning. Barn doors stood wide and empty where a herd had been. A line of reeds by the bank never rose again. They stayed as a thin, mute memory of what had been. The 4 riders had left no grand trace. They had not vanished with thunder. They had simply ceased to fill the world. In that absence, questions arrived. Where did they ride now? What law had altered? People found that some rules returned. Markets reopened. A pot boiled sooner. A child sneezed and was tended. Other things remained altered. Certain names went unspoken. Certain roads were avoided, and scars showed on walls and on hands. When the sun grew higher, the valley looked stitched. Here, a green shoot pressed through dry mud. There, a shutter hung crooked where it had been forced. The watchers had moved on, leaving the land to answer what it could and to keep the rest as a quiet record. At the ridge, a lone figure stood for a long time and watched the horizon where the 4 had been, as if trying to read an absence into a map of tomorrow.